Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. Bear witness that there is nothing worthy of worship except Allah, and that Muhammad, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, is his last divinely sent messenger and the seal of the prophethood. Ameen. We'd like to begin by welcoming our friends in South Africa, the United States, and around the world once again to this week's edition of A Conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. I'm pleased to be your host, coming to you once again through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. Our focus for today will be on this post 9/11 world of ours. We want to engage in some reflections on post 9/11, given the fact that this month marks the 21st dark anniversary of this unfortunate chapter in American and world history. We also want to shed a little bit of our discussion on the recent death of a queen and the ascension of a new king for the country known as Great Britain and its Commonwealth affiliates, which also, by the way, includes South Africa. My special guest for the hour is a return guest, alhamdulillah, my good brother Moazzam Begg. He is a former political prisoner and prisoner of war, courtesy of the so-called War on Terrorism. He is presently the outreach director of the UK-based human rights organization known as CAGE. He and I will engage in some public conversation, some dialogue on, what 9/11 means to him as a formerly, as a former unjustly held prisoner, one of the victims, one of the many victims of that war, and his thoughts on the passing of Queen Elizabeth II and the ascension of King Charles III. Without any further ado, let's bring our brother on with a hearty welcome. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Brother Moazzam.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Brother Mauri. It's a pleasure and an honor to be speaking with you and all the brothers and sisters who've facilitated this through Salam Media. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this gathering and discussion one that is of a benefit for all of us, inshallah.
Ameen, ameen. It's a real pleasure being able to revisit with you, brother, on this platform. Before we get into the meat of our discussion, I want to just alert the audience and also our brother engineer, remind him of the fact that at one point, I guess about 25 minutes or so from now, you're going to have to break away for a Salatul Maghrib, and then inshallah ta'ala, you'll come back and we will continue the conversation. During that break, there's something special and relevant to this conversation that we're going to share with the audience. So you just let us know when you need to take the break, Aki.
Inshallah.
Let's begin with what could be the most important question in this dialogue of ours today. What does 9/11 mean to you and why?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Well, to be technical, 9/11 for the rest of the world simply means the 9th of November, because our calendar works with the day first and then the month, unlike the United States of America. So what's happened, and this is a bit of a microcosm on how it's projected to the rest of the world, because this happened on the 11th of September on 2001 in the United States. The rest of the world must regard their own calendars through the prism of the United States. On this day of all days, all our own calendars get reset according to the United States version, which is strange. Because as I said, this is a kind of, if you look projected as a microcosm to the rest of the world, this both metaphorically and both practically became the most important or most ominous day in the modern history of the United States of America. But for the rest of the world, it was just another day. And for me, when I was in Afghanistan on September the 11th, 2001, it was just another day until a friend of mine came knocking on the door, banging on the door. And he said, have you heard the news? I said, what's the news? He said, America has been attacked. Now, my instant reaction was, which nation could attack America? Was it China? Was it Russia? Was it Cuba? And of course, I was in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan felt the whirlwind of the response of the United States of America. So for me, this was the beginning of the changing of my life, because from that day till now, I became a victim, a survivor, and a critic and an opponent to everything that happened on that day. I opposed what happened on that day by those who did it, and I opposed those who responded from the United States to what they did to the rest of the world.
Now, Brother Moazzam, you were born and raised in the UK, correct?
That's correct, yes, brother.
Yes. You're a British citizen of South Asian heritage. How did your kidnapping occur? And was it in Afghanistan or Pakistan, your kidnapping?
So the story is, I was in Afghanistan when 9/11 happened, but I evacuated to Pakistan, which is where my family comes from originally. So it was easy for me to kind of, reconnect there. And everybody was going there anyway because of the war. I was in my home with my family, with my wife, with my children in the city of Islamabad, where I was living and had evacuated to. And on the night of the 31st of January 2002, there was a knock on my door. I answered the door, and there were a whole group of unidentified, ununiformed Pakistani men with handguns, with tasers, stormed into the forecourt of my house. They put a gun to my head, tied my hands behind my back, put a hood over my head, and carried me away, literally in front of my family, into the back of the vehicle. In the back of this vehicle, there were CIA agents. These CIA agents said, you can either answer our questions here or in Guantanamo. One of them produced a pair of handcuffs, and he says, I was given these cuffs by my friend's wife, who was killed in 9/11, and she told me to go and catch the perpetrators. And I told him, when he cuffed my hands with those, I said, wouldn't she think you're stupid for catching the wrong guy? So that's really the beginning of my journey into US custody. I was then sent over to a secret detention site in Pakistan, but essentially run by Americans, and then handed over to the Americans after that. A long, onerous journey that I've recalled many, many times in Bagram, Kandahar, Guantanamo, and 3 years of that. And then eventually I was released without charge, without trial, back to the UK, where my family met me and greeted me.
Yeah, this is, for those who are not familiar with your story, I think it's very important for that narrative to be revisited, because for many of us in the West, especially in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, it's hard to believe that someone, and you were one of many.
Indeed.
You were one of many, could just be taken up and swept away, secretly imprisoned and tortured. Many were tortured without any semblance of quote unquote due process. It's hard to imagine for many who live in countries like ours but this was the reality. And for many, it still is the reality. I mean, you, by the grace and mercy of Allah, touching your heart the way that Allah has touched your heart, Aki, and you have been someone who has gone through that whirlwind, that very torturous whirlwind, and you came out on the other side willing to talk about it, willing to shed light on what is still happening to many others. I think if again, for the benefit of those who don't know you and who are not familiar with what the United States and its allies, quote unquote, were doing, for you to shed a bit more light. I mean, how do you know how it was you came to the attention of the authorities, and how soon did you become aware of the fact that what had happened to you wasn't just you? There were many men and boys that were picked up and sold for bounties in Pakistan and probably in other neighboring countries.
I mean, so this is it's a very, very wide subject. This is called, of course, it was called the Global War on Terror.
Yes.
And it essentially meant that the United States under George Bush was launching a war that had no boundaries. It had no beginning, it had no real beginning other than they said was 9/11, but it had no end. It's still going on. The war on terror is still going on. Guantanamo is still open. There's still 38 prisoners there, majority held without charge or trial. And the first condition to be a prisoner or a captive or a target in the war on terror, the first condition is that you must be a Muslim. That's the first condition. The second condition is that you may or may not be a terrorism suspect, but the first condition. So the war on terrorism is not a war on terrorism because there's terrorists from every single group, a religious background, political ideology, as you know, in the United States of America. So one of the things that happened to me and why was I targeted is because this is global. As I said, the entire world took part in what I call this global gang rape. Everybody was taking part. Muslim countries, Western nations, my own government. The reason why I ended up in Guantanamo is because MI5, the British Security Services, had come to my house 3 years earlier in the case of an individual who wrote to me from the Emirates saying, I'm being tortured in the presence of British intelligence agents. Can you please get me some legal assistance? So I did. And in relation to that, the MI5 came to my house. The same MI5 agents who came to my house and sat in my house and I'd offered them tea were the same ones that I saw 3 years later when there was a gun pointed to my head and I was in the middle of the Kandahar detention facility. The hood that was on my head was taken off my head. And I looked to see that same MI5 agent who'd sat in my home in Birmingham, England, was now sitting here in Kandahar working with the Americans and feeding them information saying that this guy had a connection to extremists. No legal process, no charge, no presumption of innocence. I saw brothers tortured to death, beaten and punched to the point at which they were saying, Allah, Allah, and the guards found it amusing that the person is saying Allah while he's being kicked repeatedly. I was subjected to the sounds of a woman screaming. I was led to believe it was my wife in the next cell being tortured, and they suggested my kids, my little children, were in custody too. They threatened to send me to Syria or Egypt, as they had sent others, to be further tortured, to be outsourced. Alhamdulillah, by Allah's grace, I did eventually get returned from Guantanamo. But since that time till now, I have been involved in exposing Britain, America, Libya, Syria, you name the country, Egypt, that have all been involved in either directly or indirectly as a part of this rendition and torture program that has become this part of the so-called war on terrorism, which I call a war on Muslims who want to establish their own identity and future.
Mm-hmm. My brother, it's my understanding that you and 3 other British citizens were released in 2005 by the order of then U.S. President George W. Bush over the objections, and this is an important point, over the objections of the CIA, FBI, and the Pentagon, and that it was done as a favor to then British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who was catching a lot of heat from the public. Were you aware of that when this was happening, or and what is your, what was your take on
my understanding of all of this is that George Bush wasn't doing me any favors, and neither was Tony Blair. They were both strong and very, very, very vocal Islamophobes, very much believed in their war on terrorism. So I can't imagine either of them doing me any favors. No, the truth is this, my brother, is that there was a massive campaign mounted by my father, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on his soul, and he made it a very high profile campaign. He went from here to the House of Parliament, spoke to the foreign minister, went to the United States, went to Washington, D.C., met with and started a massive campaign. And he said something very, very simple, but very powerful. He said, if my son has committed a crime, take him to the court and apply your laws. Up until that point, a man is according to the law that you have told us since you colonized our lands from which we came, and you said that you have a better system than everybody else. Now I'm going to put you to the test. If he's not committed a crime, then he's innocent according to the law, no matter what you say, no matter how many of you object. He's innocent. You're the criminals. To hold somebody without charge or trial is a crime in law. It's called false imprisonment. It doesn't matter whether an individual does it or whether a state does it. In fact, when a state does it, there's a greater onus on the state, because the state is supposed to protect people, not to incarcerate them or to kill them extrajudicially, which is what the United States was doing. So this was a very powerful statement made by my father, and the likes of Amnesty International and many others took it on, and they said, tell us according to law, is the law being applied to this British citizen who could face execution in the United States, in Guantanamo, if this continues? Because clearly, if you can hold somebody without charge or trial, why can't you kill them without charge or trial? What's the difference? And so he argued this very strong point, and eventually Tony Blair was forced by that pressure to do what was the right thing, was get these guys who've never been charged with a crime back home. So Tony Blair or anybody, it's that famous statement of Malcolm X. I'll never forget it. You don't take a knife, put it in a man's back 9 inches deep, pull it back a couple of inches, saying we're making progress, that we did you a favor by pulling that knife out of your back. You stuck it in to begin with. And that's what they did. So when they pulled that knife out a little bit, they said, oh, we've done favors for each other. No, you didn't. You just did what you should have done long ago. We then fought against the British government and MI5, a case in which we won a settlement to say that they had been involved. The British government had been fully involved in the abuse and the torture of British citizens, including myself and 15 others.
Yes. May Allah Ta'ala bless your father, the soul of your father. Ameen. Alhamdulillah, that I didn't know it was your father that spearheaded the campaign, brother. The pressure campaign to bring attention. Alhamdulillah.
He was a powerhouse, mashallah.
That's a tremendous legacy, alhamdulillah. What was your return like, Aki? What has your return been like? And when did you make the decision? When did you make the decision that you needed to not just fade away into the woodwork and but to fight, to be on the front line fighting this fight?
By Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grace, even though I was in solitary confinement most of my time in Guantanamo, I met some soldiers, some decent American soldiers and others, to whom I said, could you send this letter out for me? And I believe, in my belief is that some of them did. And that could have got them into a lot of trouble. But in that letter, I wrote that I had seen people murdered. I saw 2 prisoners murdered. I mean, beaten to death, tortured to death in cold blood, which has been accepted by the United States. And the story of the death of some of these people is featured in an Oscar-winning documentary called Taxi to the Dark Side. So I'd already begun that. When I came out, of course, I was reunited with my family. I met a son that I'd never seen before. He was now 3 years old, the first time I've ever seen him in my life. And my other kids who had now grown up 3 years older. But I knew that there were many faces of prisoners that I didn't see, but I used to hear their voices. They say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Hani and Mari. And they used to say when food used to come, even if it was a tiny amount of food, there was just a lot of love for the brothers from wherever they happen to be from, whether it's Turkey or from Kenya, from Nigeria, from Mali, from Pakistan, India, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. These brothers, the one thing that connected us all was our faith, was La ilaha illallah. So knowing that I was free and that they weren't, I felt a massive duty upon me, guilt even, that I need to fight for them. And eventually I joined Cage and have been with them since, fighting since that time, since 2005 till now. I didn't stop. The organization didn't stop. The campaign to get them released didn't stop. But we also then began to uncover there's a Guantanamoization of what's happening in the war on terrorism. Because of what America did in Guantanamo, the Chinese government can do to the Muslims in East Turkestan, put them in concentration camps while citing the same language that George Bush used. You can see the targeting of Muslims in India, in Palestine. Of course, it's normal. The use of the language in Europe to pass law after law every year, which almost exclusively targets Muslims as a quote-unquote terrorist, extremist, radical community that has a problem within it. And much of this stemmed from Guantanamo and the treatment of Muslims there. As I said, every prisoner in Guantanamo is a Muslim, yet every terrorist in the world is far from being a Muslim. So we've tried to expose this at every level that we can, that Islamophobia that has been pushed across the world isn't just people on the street pulling off hijabs or calling names to Muslims. This is at state level. This is legislation that's being passed year after year that sometimes, especially in Europe, I know in America it might be difficult, but in Europe, in Britain in particular, I know people who've gone to prison for writing poetry in the great land of Shakespeare because they're Muslim. They've gone to prison for writing poetry and gone to prison for distributing and writing books, distributing and publishing books that were written in the 8th or 9th century AD. This is the land of literature. So it's gone insane. And we're trying to challenge it on every level.
Yes. SubhanAllah. Brother, there's a piece of video that I'd like for you to see and get your thoughts on. It's a short piece of video of former President George W. Bush engaged in a huge Freudian slip. You may have already seen it, but you've seen it. Let's show that, Brother Sadiq, now, and we'll come back and have Brother.
Straight after this, I'm going to go and break for Salah, and then I'll come back, inshallah.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Okay.
Now, I don't have a great segue here, but I absolutely have to play you this piece of tape we just got in. Former President George W. Bush was delivering a speech at his presidential center today at Southern Methodist University in Texas. And while talking about Russia and its president, he made what must be one of the biggest Freudian slips of all time.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway. 75.
I'm not laughing. And I'm guessing nor are the families of the thousands of American troops and the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who died in that war.
Okay, alhamdulillah. I want to share during this little break here a piece of thought-provoking commentary, an essay that was published last year, marking the 20th anniversary of 9/11, This was written by a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist affiliated with the Washington Post newspaper. The title, 9/11 was a test. Now, I've shared this in my various social media platforms with friends and relatives and colleagues in and outside the human rights field. I'm just going to share right now the introduction of this long essay. If you haven't seen it, you need to give yourself an opportunity to sit down with it. It's a long piece, and it's very, very well documented and thought-provoking, really. I'm just going to share the introduction. 9/11 was a test. Deep within the catalog of regrets that is the 9/11 Commission report, long after readers learn of the origins and objectives of Al-Qaeda, past the warnings ignored by consecutive administrations, through the many institutional failures that allow terrorists to hijack 4 commercial airliners, the authors pause to make a rousing case for the power of the nation's character. Quote, the U.S. government must define what the message is, what it stands for. The report asserts, we should offer an example of moral leadership in the world, committed to treat people humanely, abide by the rule of law, and be generous and caring to our neighbors. We need to defend our ideals abroad vigorously. America does stand up for its values. End quote. Now, this affirmation of American idealism is one of the document's more opinionated, one of its more opinionated moments. Looking back, it's also among the most ignored. Rather than exemplify the nation's highest values, the official response to 9/11 unleashed some of its worst qualities: deception, brutality, arrogance, ignorance, delusion, overreach, and carelessness. This conclusion is laid bare in the sprawling literature to emerge from 9/11 over the past 2 decades, the works of investigation, memoir, and narrative by journalists and former officials that have charted the path to that day, revealed the heroism and confusion of the early response, chronicled the battles in and about Afghanistan and Iraq, and uncovered the excesses of the war on terror. Reading or rereading a collection of such books today is like watching an old movie that feels more anguishing and frustrating than you remember. The anguish comes from knowing how the tale will unfold, the frustration from realizing that this was hardly the only possible outcome. Whatever individual stories the 9/11 books tell, too many describe the repudiation of U.S. values, not by extremist outsiders, but by our own hand. The betrayal of America's professed principles was the friendly fire of the war on terror. In these works, indifference to the growing terrorist threat gives way to bloodlust and vengeance after the attacks. Official dissembling justifies wars, then prolongs them. In the name of counterterrorism, security is politicized, savagery legalized, and patriotism weaponized. It was an emergency. Yes, that's understood. But that state of exception became our new American exceptionalism. It happened fast. By 2004, when the 9/11 Commission urged America to, quote, engage the struggle of ideas. Subhanallah, I'm sorry. I just lost my place. Give me a moment. I see you're back. I'm just finishing up on this, brother. I lost my place, and I just want to finish up. Yeah, okay. It happened fast. By 2004, when the 9/11 Commission urged America to engage the struggle of ideas, it was already too late. The Justice Department's initial torture memos were already signed. The Abu Ghraib images had already eviscerated U.S. claims to moral authority, and it has lasted long. The latest works on the legacy of 9/11 show how war on terror tactics were turned on religious groups, immigrants, and protesters in the United States. The war on terror came home, and it walked in like it owned the place. It is for now easier, and this is a quote, it is for now easier for a researcher to explain how and why September 11th happened than it is to explain the aftermath, end quote. This is from Steve Cole. He writes in his book, Ghost Wars, his 2004 account of the CIA's pre-9/11 involvement in Afghanistan. It's pre-9/11 involvement in Afghanistan. Throughout that aftermath, Washington fantasized about remaking the world in its image, only to reveal an ugly image of itself to the world. The literature of 9/11 also considers Osama bin Laden's varied aspirations for the attacks and his shifting visions of that aftermath. He originally imagined America as weak and easily panicked, retreating from the world, in particular from the Middle East, as soon as its troops began dying. But bin Laden also came to grasp, perhaps self-servingly, the benefits of luring Washington into imperial overreach, of bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy, quote unquote, as he put it in 2004, through endless military expansionism, thus beating back its global sway and undermining its internal unity. Quote, we anticipate a black future for America, bin Laden told ABC News more than 3 years before the 9/11 attacks. Instead of remaining United States, it shall end up separated states and shall have to carry the bodies of its sons back to America, end quote. Bin Laden did not win the war of ideas, but neither did we. To an unnerving degree, the United States moved towards the enemy's fantasies of what it might become, a nation divided in its sense of itself, exposed in its moral and political compromises, conflicted over wars it did not want but would not end. When President George W. Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office on the evening of September 11th, 2001, he asserted that America was attacked because of, quote, it is the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep the light from shining, end quote. Bush was correct. Al-Qaeda could not dim the promise of America. Only we could do that to ourselves. And that's the end of the introduction of 9/11 was a test. I just wanted to share that as some additional background for this conversation I'm having with my brother. And let me just say this. I don't know if you got a chance to read it, Brother Moazzam. I sent it to you, the link to this long essay to you that was published in the Washington Post last year on the 20th anniversary. It is so thought-provoking because it's coming from a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who accepts the basic line, the fundamental narrative that the ones that 9/11 took place the way that the official narrative and the folks behind it say it took place. I don't buy that entire official narrative. I don't buy, for one, that Afghanistan was any more responsible, or agents out of Afghanistan was any more responsible for it than agents out of Iraq. I consider both of those wars to have been unjust conflicts and just, crimes against humanity. But this is written by someone who accepts the official narrative, but brings attention to the fact that 9/11, our nation's response and the global community's, its allies' response to 9/11 distorted values that America, that Britain, that France, that a number of other countries ostensibly are supposed to, rest their laurels on. And so with that said, did you get a chance to read it? And if you did, brother, what are your thoughts on that?
I did get a chance to read it, though I don't remember all the detail. But suffice to say that the United States' role in Afghanistan and Iraq, as you said, one led to the other, but one was not connected to the other. In fact, neither, as nations, were connected to the attacks. They didn't carry out the attacks. No Afghan was involved in the attacks. In fact, if you wanted to look at it, the number of people that carried out the attacks of any one nation, the largest of was from Saudi Arabia. So wouldn't it make sense then to go for Saudi Arabia in some way or the other? And of course, the answer was going to be never. Never was that going to happen. But to go for a country like Afghanistan, a nation like Afghanistan, that's poor, that's landlocked, that doesn't have any of the resources that the Western world had, this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they decided to do this. But what they didn't know is that, and they didn't read the history, is that this is not the country to attack. Because once you do this, you will be in a quagmire, the likes of which you will never be able to extricate yourself from. And in doing so, the United States took part in the longest war in its, I would say, bloody history, a history that is very violent, from the inception, from the Independence War to the Civil War, to World War I, World War II, the using of atomic bombs in World War II, the invasions of Korea, North Korea, and Vietnam, and so forth. This was 20 years that cost approximately $300 million a day, the equivalent of $8 trillion cost the American taxpayer. At the end of that, they had to negotiate a peace, a withdrawal, because they could not continue the fight against the Taliban. And the discussion, the real icing on the cake was that the negotiations were made with brothers who were held with me in Guantanamo. They were released and sent as a result of a prisoner exchange with an American soldier called Sergeant Bo Bergdahl that the Taliban were holding. And in Qatar, in Doha, the United States began a conversation with the Taliban, with these same brothers who opened the political office of the Islamic Emirate. And it was as a result of that that eventually the withdrawal took place. So after 20 years of war, after 900,000, at least the conservative estimates, 900,000 people killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's the equivalent of 500 9/11s taking place. 500 9/11s taking place in the Muslim world. And at the end of that, defeat. It wasn't a military battlefield defeat, but then nowadays rarely are they. This was simply a defeat in ideas, a defeat in the, do you have the political will to carry on? Because the Taliban leadership said, if you don't leave, we will fight you for another 100 years. Are you prepared for that? No nation wants war, nor does it deserve it. But once you enter somebody's homeland, Who is the occupier? Who's the oppressor? And American soldiers, I know, I've met American soldiers who told me that I never wanted to see myself as an occupier, as an abuser, as a torturer, to be allied with that. I saw myself, I've always seen myself and my nation as the good guys. But here we are acting again as the actual bad guys. And it's the most, I've heard this from American soldiers who are very sincere and decent people who said that to me. So in the end, what did you gain? What did the United States as a nation gain other than the disdain and the disrespect of the rest of the world? Because the United States is a nation, if you compare it to many others, that does have many laws and rights and freedoms that others don't. That's what attracts a lot of people to it. But if you scratch the surface when it comes to its foreign policy, and I say this as a Briton, somebody who knows US culture, who's connected to the United States through that link with Britain, is that that it's no longer the case. My wife, remember, she used to say to me, I remember a time when everybody used to love the United States, and she said, now that's no longer the case.
Well, brother, we are winding down now in this broadcast, and I would be remiss if I did not invite your thoughts on something that has certainly the full blast attention of your nation and many other nations around the world. After 70 years on the British throne, Queen Elizabeth II has passed away. Do you recall the first, your very first thought, the first thought that came to mind when you learned of her passing?
Well, one thought that came to my mind was that it's been a long reign. It's been a long time. And in fact, it's been the longest time in the history of the British Empire, the British world, of Great Britain, the longest reigning monarch in history, longer than Queen Victoria, longer than Elizabeth I, longer than the first King Charles. So this is it's a massive moment, and it's not because of kingship or monarchy, but it's just a name that's been around for such a long time. Since I was a child, and I was a child, she was an old woman. So let alone now. And so many people have been affected by it. So there's no doubt that there's been this constant. When you said earlier on, you said the death of the Queen. You didn't say the Queen of Britain. You don't need to, because when you say the Queen, there's only one the Queen. You think about monarchs of other countries, nobody even knows their names. Nobody even knows who they are. Nobody knows whether they exist. Who knows whether that Sweden has a monarchy, that Netherlands, that Spain all have a monarchy. Nobody knows, nobody cares. So there is this aspect that globally people are talking about. And as you said earlier on, she was also the Queen of the Commonwealth, of which South Africa and many other countries, Canada, Australia and others have been part of. But there's another part of this, and that is dark side. And the dark side is that she was the last relic of the colonial British Empire. When she came to the throne, Britain still had colonies that were seeking and fighting for independence from the yoke of British oppression. And unfortunately, there are still countries who were under the yoke of the British Empire, who were celebrating, literally saying, not celebrating the death, but rather commemorating 3 days of national holiday because of the death of the Queen. The Queen, who was the head of the empire which itself regarded these nations and the people of those nations as subhuman, regarded them as cannon fodder, regarded them as, to this point, as an example. There are hundreds of thousands of Muslims, black, white, and beyond, who fought for the empire that were not even recognized in World War I and World War II. They were not even treated as equal citizens, let alone human beings. And their contribution, the example of which is that you've got animals that died in these wars have been commemorated with statues, yet not even a mention of the Muslims and non-Muslims, as I said, black and Asian, who got killed. Not that it's something to be proud of, to be killed fighting for empire, but a recognition that these people had a right, just like now today, often the racism that exists says that you people come into our country, you take from us, you've done nothing for us, which is totally untrue, because there were hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions including my grandparents' generation and my grandparents, actually my grandfather and his father before him, for better or for worse, who fought for the Indian Army in the British Empire for World War I and World War II and beyond. So that's the darker side that people don't want to discuss, that this empire which the Queen was the last remaining meaningful symbol of, still has a lot to answer for what it did to the rest of the world.
I agree. And what are your thoughts on the new king, Charles III, especially as it pertains to the bit of controversy that appears to surround his ascension to the throne? What are your thoughts on him? Well,
I'd say that there's I have a book here which is about the contribution to civilization, Islamic contribution to civilization, and he says something very profound. He said there has been an attempt, a conscious attempt to erase and eradicate the contribution that Muslims have made to society, to science, and to the advancements of the world. This means to remove the Islamic, particularly through the Golden Age and what it had done and given the West, so that it eventually came into its renaissance through the studying and the transfer of Arabic knowledge from the Muslim world. So there is, and he has repeatedly spoken about Islam in very broad terms, in a very positive way. He even condemned Salman Rushdie, the author who recently got attacked in the United States, for the books that he'd written, in which he had attacked the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is unusual in the West. And so I think the Muslims would probably have more of a soft spot for him. Nonetheless, he's now a symbol of that very monarchy that I spoke of earlier on. And it's seeped within tradition of empire. It's seeped of if you've seen anything about how his inauguration will be and how the Queen's death has been, it's seeped in the massive traditions of empire. Even the song "God Save the Queen," unfortunately, there are some Muslims who are singing it now. That's "God Save the King." Some of the words say, "Lead him victorious, valiant and glorious. Long should he reign over us." You're talking about this was written at the height of empire, when they were occupying and usurping and killing and torturing in Muslim and other lands. So this is part of that legacy, and we shouldn't be blind to it. Nonetheless, the king will be around, and it'll become another symbol for the rest of the world. They'll probably, again, when they say the word "the king," they'll only mean the king of Britain, because no other king will be known.
That's quite interesting, brother, your observations, and I agree with you. It's one of the things that has really stood out for me, especially as it pertains, or I should say particularly as it pertains to the ascension of Charles to the throne. How much controversy there was connected to him as a result of his I'm sorry, I'm being distracted. Someone is at the door, but anyway, I wasn't aware of just how much negative imagery there was surrounding his potential ascension to the throne, connected to the views that he has shared concerning Islam and Muslims until just very recently. And it has I'm aware of this new movie that has come out concerning the late Princess Diana. And I can't help but wonder if this movie coming out at this time and all of the discussions that are going on around it and the way that it's being used to revisit that bit of scandal connected to the two of them, unfortunate scandal, it's being done to sully this man's image, given some of the things that he has said and some of the positions that he has taken vis-a-vis Islam and Muslims. You know, Allah knows best, but you know, I like you see a potential opening in a new dialogue between, you know, the Muslim world and the West, represented by this country that has played an enormous role in global history, you know, over the past you know, couple of centuries. So you know, again, I can't help but wonder if that is indeed, if the two are tied together, you know, this revisiting. Because my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew was actually in line to ascend the throne after his mother's passing. Andrew was, before the scandal erupted involving him and that pervert out of the United States. I forgot his name right now, but
Epstein.
Epstein, yeah, Jeffrey Epstein. And he ended up having to be sidelined because of that scandal, and that put Charles in the position of becoming what he has now become. You know.
Yeah, I think, Brother Mauri, that's not correct. So Prince Charles, Prince Charles was known as, was the Prince of Wales, and the Prince of Wales in England is the as it were the next to be prince. So now the Prince of Wales, the current Prince of Wales, is William, who is now taking the position that his father was. However, Andrew's position, he did, I believe, I may be wrong, and again, I'm not all completely, he's the Duke of York, so it's a strong, very powerful position where he would be in line, but not in line to be right next to the throne. His disgrace came, of course, as you said correctly, to the point at which he was supposed to be stripped of his titles and his military titles, yet he was there in the process, in the processions, seen very much. And this is how you can see that this whole thing, because the country is in such a state of mourning that everything around the family now has become sanitized, including him. So just, you know, literally last year, a year before, he was persona non grata. Nobody wanted to talk to him about him. It was a complete disgrace, brought disgrace on the family. And now he can walk with his medals in his uniform as I said, a sanitized, re-sanitized part of the family. But as you said about Charles, I agree. The cynicism I've seen on both sides. On the Muslim side, I've seen Muslims saying, "Don't fall for it. He may say that that he likes Islam, etc., but this is just a ploy." And as you said, many people who don't like Islam will say he's an Islamophobe. In the end, you know, we can only judge upon the apparent, and what's important for us as Muslims to ensure that we don't do injustice to non-Muslims, and that we don't attribute Iman and faith where it doesn't exist. So we stay the middle path, and we remember that in the end that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will judge us as well as those. And what we need to do is to continue to strive for what is right, to call people to Islam, to call people to truth and to justice, whether they're kings or whether they're taxi drivers. It makes no difference, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides who he wishes in whichever way he wishes, whenever he does.
Excellent, Nasiha, my brother. I agree with you 100%. We are at the end of the broadcast now. What I want the engineer, I'm going to ask the engineer to do is to, there's a photograph, an image of an emaciated, physically and mentally emaciated Afia Siddiqui, based upon a photograph that was taken of her when she just, you know, when she had reappeared mysteriously in Ghazni in 2008, before she ended up being shot by the American soldier. It's a very powerful image of that photo of Afia juxtaposed against a photo of, or an image, I should say, of American soldiers. Brother Sadiq showed that image, and while he is doing so, Aki, I would like for you to close us out by sharing your thought on that image, and, you know, along with any final thought that you would like to share, that you feel is appropriate to share in the closing moments of this of today's broadcast. And the reason why also I wanted to show that image is because, next month, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to have a very important rally in front of the prison where Afi is being held in Fort Worth, Texas, right outside that base, that reserve base. And inshallah ta'ala, we're beginning the process of beating the drums for this. And then this will take place next month. The following month in November, we're planning to have a rally for all of our political prisoners, to bring attention to all of them, inshallah ta'ala, in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. So with that said, your closing thoughts, both on the image in front of us and what that image has come to represent in the wake of 9/11 and what all 9/11 has come to represent for the global community.
Well, brother, first of all, Jazakallah khair for everything that you've done in trying to campaign for and keeping the case of Afia Siddiqui alive. She's, I would say, one of the final cases in the war on terrorism that has been remains unresolved. It is the most profound case. It is the most disturbing case, and she's the most victimized, most targeted, abused person that I've seen in this war on terrorism. And that is precisely because she's a woman, and also because of her own government selling her out, and because of what the United States has done to try to make an example of her. You see that image with the American soldiers pointing guns towards her, and immediately what comes into my mind is the reason why she's incarcerated to begin with. She was accused of unbelievably trying to take a weapon, an arm of an American soldier, trying to shoot him, missing, and then getting shot in return. Now, this beggars belief, because I was held by the United States as soldiers in Bagram, in Kandahar, in Guantanamo, and not once ever did a male in those 20-odd years get an opportunity to take a weapon, to even attempt to take a weapon of a United States soldier, a Marine, or a reservist, and that weapon would A, be loaded, B, would be in the vicinity of a prisoner, C, that you could even get to that weapon before somebody shooting you. And somehow Afia Siddiqui, with her small frame and petite body and her emaciated look, as you said, would have all of that wherewithal and know how to cock the rifle, know how to take the safety off, know how to aim it, and all of those things. We're made to believe that somehow she knew how to do all of this within seconds, while her child, her son Ahmed, is next to her. So I simply do not believe that narrative. And I think none of us should. And the fact that the evidence taken by and presented with those who were there, including the chiefs of police in Ghazni and beyond, the fact that that evidence hasn't been looked at properly at all in her trial, the fact that Afia Siddiqui has been given 86 years for a crime that even American soldiers were killed, no one has paid such a price for, is beyond belief. That the Americans could negotiate with the Taliban and they are free now. Some of them are ministers in their government, yet Afia Siddiqui remains in prison, is a massive miscarriage of justice, and it needs to be revisited, and we should never forget.
Ameen. Thank you, my brother. I couldn't think of a better way to end this broadcast. I and Afia's family and her supporters globally are in your debt also for you and Cage and other members of your human rights organization, keeping alive the flame of freedom for so many of our prisoners who are wrongfully held in different parts of the world, including still secret prisons in a number of countries that we don't even know about, these dark sites. With that, inshallah ta'ala, we close out as we normally do. We want to invite our friends to share this video, share this retrospective on 9/11. It's very, very important. And then don't just rest on it, but take this information and do something with it. we close. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim wal Asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. Illa ladina amanu wa amalu salihati wa tawassaw bil haqq wa tawassaw bis sabr. Which means, the translation of the meaning, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, by the token of time, through the ages, surely humanity is in loss, except those who believe and do good, and exhort one another to truth, and exhort one another to patiently persevere. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.